participation of non-white, non-European peoples in that war. 20 years later, and living in the northeast of England, I learnt of the Great War, in part through the story of my local regiment, back when young boys in England had local regiments with which to associate. Visits to the little museum of the Durham Light Infantry inspired a fascination with the First World War that has endured for a third of a century. The most powerful moment for me, in a lifetime of reading about the 1914-18 conflict, was when I came across a trench map of a section of the Western Front that had been manned by my regiment. Men who 70 years earlier had sat in the same classrooms of the same Victorian red brick schools that I was attending had, during the war, named their stretches of the line after the streets of our shared hometown of Gateshead, Bensham Bank and Coatsworth Road, streets that I, an immigrant child from Africa, now played in. For many of the soldiers of the Durham Light Infantry, their first encounter with people like me, people from Africa, would have been in the zones behind the Western Front into which were drawn millions of men, the soldiers and labourers from the colonial worlds of the early 20th century. This book is an attempt, although an inevitably incomplete one, to explore that moment of encounter and to describe the experiences of the often forgotten armies who came from beyond the borders of Europe to fight and labour in the First World War. It aims also to examine some of the forces, political, ideological, religious, economic, and demographic, that drew these disparate multiracial cohorts into the world's first truly global conflict. Limits of time and space have resulted in painful omissions. There was no space for an exploration of the multi-ethnic struggle fought on the Gallipoli Peninsula, nor the far greater conflagration that swept across the deserts of Mesopotamia, a sideshow of the First World War that now seems more important than ever, as the lines drawn in the sands of Arabia in 1919 begin to disintegrate. Likewise, the contributions of the Maoris of New Zealand, the Aboriginal peoples of Australia, and the soldiers and labourers who came from North Africa and French Indochina are mentioned only in passing. No book can ever hope to cover everything, but I hope that this book will, like the television series that it accompanies, play a small part in the slow process of historical rediscovery, the engine of which has been the pioneering efforts of the many scholars whose work I refer to and cite throughout. David Olusoga. Chapter 1. Weltkrieg. A new concept, the World's War. The environs of Ypres, Flanders, 22nd of April 1915. It is, in the words of the British official history of the First World War, a glorious spring day on the West Flanders plain. Reports coming in from reconnaissance planes flying missions over the great arc of trenches to the east of Ypres describe considerable liveliness behind the German lines, but nothing that is particularly out of the ordinary. At about 4 p.m, German artillery begins shelling British and French lines. But then at 5 p.m. exactly, a sudden and ferocious bombardment opens up against the small villages in front of Ypres, which up until now have largely escaped the attentions of the enemy guns. At that same moment, all along a 4-mile stretch of the German front line, thousands of hands scrabble to open thousands of taps that are attached to rows of metal canisters. Each canister weighs 90 pounds, and 6,000 of them have recently been hauled into place behind the German parapets. Their collective contents weigh 160 tons. The artillery bombardment stops abruptly at 5:10 p.m, and it is around now that troops from the French 45th and 78th Divisions, Algerians and Moroccans, including both white colonialists and North Africans, notice two strange clouds moving inexorably towards their trenches. Some men also report hearing a hissing noise coming from the German lines. The clouds will later be described as being green, yellowish-green, or grey-green. British